Changing sea levels are threatening our coastal marsh and barrier island habitats, and currently the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers spends billions of dollars a year dredging and renourishing areas to help mitigate those effects. With that, we're seeing an increase in the number of engineering with nature projects, not only in coastal areas that are experiencing increased erosion due to sea level rise impacts, but also inland areas such as floodplain and riverine systems where flood risk reduction and resilient design concepts are just as critical. To assist with these trends, the use of remote sensing offers an opportunity to improve how we're quantifying and communicating project benefits. So collectively, remote sensing refers to a suite of technologies that encompasses everything from data collection and processing to analysis. Recent technological advances allow us to better map and characterize hundreds of square kilometers, but with project-relevant spatial detail. One project where we've successfully used remote sensing is the West Bay project. This combines U.S. Army Corps of Engineers navigation and ecosystem restoration missions. It's located in the Mississippi River Delta and utilizes innovative nature-based solutions.
Since about 1945 until the year 2000, West Bay, which is about 12,000 acres in size, lost nearly 8,000 acres of land to open water. This threatened the Federal Navigation Channel because we were losing the marshes behind the bank lines. When you lose the marshes, you threaten the bank lines. And when you threaten the bank lines, you threaten the Federal Navigation Channel. So the Army Corps of Engineers New Orleans District designed and built a diversionary channel that encouraged flow out of the main stem of the Mississippi River into West Bay, encouraging land building. Our New Orleans District also placed dredge material out of the Federal Navigation Channel into West Bay to help restore that land. The remote sensing data is instrumental to help us understand not only what worked, but how and why it worked. We wanted to document the land loss between 1945 and the year 2000. That was very important. But we also wanted to understand explicitly how the land gain happened between 2003, when the diversionary channel was built, and the present time.
Remote sensing was a valuable resource for rapidly extracting that information from aerial photography over the large spatial and temporal scale of the project. So the ability to visualize changes over time helps us to illustrate the dynamic processes that are transforming the landscape. For example, we used image analysis techniques to identify land and water habitat within the project area and to quantify the changes of that ratio over time. The ability to track changes over the life cycle of the project helps resource managers to evaluate the effectiveness of the restoration features as well as to quantify the environmental benefits.
So we had another engineering with nature project that was ideal for using remotely sensed data. The purpose of that project was to assess the movement and impact of dredge sediment that had been placed in a nearshore berm along the northern Chandeleur Islands in southeast Louisiana. The difficulty in monitoring places like the Chandeleur Islands are: one, the remote location of the island chain; two, the sheer distance or area that must be monitored; and three, the challenging conditions in which field researchers must operate. One of our objectives was to use remotely sensed data to assess when and where berm sediments were moving or being redistributed inside and outside of the island system. Another objective was to assess how those redistributed or moved sediments impacted vegetated features, whether it be existing features or newly created island features. We used LiDAR data that were collected from airplanes to assess changes in elevation, but also how sediments moved or were redistributed inside of the island system. Ultimately, we use these and other remote sensing data and methods to assess changes in island features pre-berm construction, post-berm construction, and after sediments were redistributed inside the island system.
Our overall goal is to improve the way we're integrating remote sensing approaches into the Engineering with Nature project portfolio. This is especially advantageous in areas where traditional field-based methods may be limited due to access constraints and making them difficult. Ultimately, we're looking to enhance project efficiencies through the use of updated remote sensing methods across the Engineering with Nature project lifecycle that are also broadly applicable to projects that share the goal of using natural and nature-based features all across the country.
Good morning and welcome to a very special ERDC Live. I am your host, Shelley Tingle with the U.S. Army Engineer Research and Development Center. Today, I am joined by three tremendous leaders in our nation's efforts to mitigate the effects of climate change. From his first days in office, President Joe Biden declared climate change a threat to our nation and world. And many of his actions in office have challenged the federal government to be more innovative in its efforts to confront that threat. In April, President Biden issued an executive order titled Strengthening the Nation's Forests, Communities, and Local Economies. Part of that order calls for the principles of USACE's Engineering with Nature initiative to be included in the government's efforts to tackle climate change and enhance resilience. Engineering with Nature pursues nature-based solutions to address our nation's infrastructure challenges. Here to help lead today's discussion is Dr. Todd Bridges, National Lead for Engineering with Nature, which has been advocating, educating, and implementing nature-based solutions on a global scale for more than 10 years. As our guest, we welcome Mrs. Deborah Loomis, the Senior Advisor to Climate Change to the Secretary of Navy, and Mr. Justin Ehrenwerth, the President and CEO of the Water Institute of the Gulf. Both are leaders in their fields and among the strongest advocates for natural and nature-based engineering solutions. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Todd, for also co-hosting this discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much, Shelley, for sharing the space with me here. And I want to start by saying, you know, Deb and Justin, I've been looking forward to this conversation very much. And I want to start by providing you both with an opportunity to introduce yourself and tell your personal story and how you got where you are now, and to include within that a nature story that was formative or important to you. So we'll start with Deb.
Okay. Thank you, Todd. I've also been looking forward to talking with you. It's always a pleasure. So let's see, my personal story. I am a retired naval officer. So I spent 21 years in the Navy. Started out driving ships on a couple of destroyers as a surface warfare officer, and then the Navy sent me to law school, and I became a JAG, and that TV show is becoming a bit dated, but I think people still know it, judge advocate otherwise. And after a few years, I specialized in environmental law. So that's what I did for kind of the last third of my career in the Navy, is defend the Navy in protect its right to train and test, and really kind of balance environmental stewardship with our needs to train and test in the oceans and on land, et cetera. I retired and took some time off and then became a counsel so a lawyer, civilian lawyer for the Navy. But all the while, I've had this deep passion for climate change and did a lot of writing on the linkage between security, national security, and climate, sort of in my personal capacity. And then one fateful day, I got a phone call saying, "Hey, do you know anyone that would be interested in being the climate advisor for the Department of the Navy?" I waited about a millisecond and put both hands up, and so fortunately here I am, which is an absolute dream. I lead off basically every speech I give just saying this is the dream. This is the dream job. Could not ask for anything more. In terms of a nature story, I grew up on the water, so always connected to water. Grew up in Connecticut. I rowed crew. I joined the Navy. So water's always been important to me. It's all just very calming and soothing. I think what I'll highlight is how I came here. Is I read a book called "Cows Save the Planet" by one of my favorite people now, and it was a very provocative title, right? Like, wait a minute, cows save the planet. Cows are supposed to be trashing the planet. And, but really it wasn't about really cows or meat, it was about soil. And it was about the importance of soil and land management as a climate solution. And I just became fascinated with this because it was climate work that wasn't about more regulation. It wasn't about job killing, or it was about kind of farmers, ranchers, land managers, stewards, kind of at the very most basic level, how they could influence climate mitigation, adaptation. So I actually drove up to Vermont where the author lives so I could meet her in person. And anyway, that started me on this journey, was actually a book.
Yeah. That's an impressive journey. Driving destroyers to law to now advocate for soil. That's fantastic.
Yeah, and I never thought, soil was kind of a fringe issue, and it's so great that's really kind of where engineering with nature, a lot of this comes down to our management of soil and water and just kind of those basic building blocks of ecosystems. So it's amazing how it all's come together.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, Justin, let's see what your story is.
Well, it's very difficult to follow that story. But first of all, it's a total pleasure.
You haven't driven destroyers?
Not yet, although there's always hope for the future. Well, I'm from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, so I grew up in some rolling hills, but I've always been attracted to the mountains. And so I'll start with my nature story. I did my undergraduate degree in Maine, and between high school and college, I thought to myself, well, I've hiked in Vermont and I've hiked in New Hampshire. I've never hiked in Maine, so maybe what I'll do is I'll walk the border. I'll walk from New Hampshire into Maine, and that's an area of the Appalachian Trail called it's Mahoosic Notch, is one of my happiest places, if you will, where you have these boulders that have tumbled down into this valley over time, and you're going up and under and taking off your pack, and they're not big mountains in comparison to what we'll find out west and other parts of the world. I think Old Speck's, not much more than 4,000 feet. But for some reason, I now have spent the last 10 years at 0 feet elevation. But I think that formative experience was really in the mountains, and I look for opportunities to get back there and get back with our 2 sons. But in any case, I thought for a while I was going to be a philosopher. I went and did my undergraduate degree and a graduate degree in philosophy, and decided that maybe that wasn't the right track for me, and got involved in politics. Worked on John Kerry's presidential campaign in 2004. Then decided I was very interested in civil rights, so I decided that law school made sense for similar but perhaps different reasons, and went to law school. And as I was finishing, then Senator Barack Obama was running for president. Got involved in the campaign, and when he won, I was invited to join the U.S. Department of Commerce in the General Counsel's office. And I thought, well, that probably means business and trade, and okay, let me see if I'm interested in that. Turns out that 65+% of the Department of Commerce's budget is NOAA. And as I got there and got involved in the issues, my portfolio really was NOAA's portfolio. And so got involved in some climate issues, and then about a year and a half into that first term, April 20th, 2010, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill took place. 11 people lost their lives. We remember the images of the oil gushing for so many days. And I got involved in the immediate response activities, and then ultimately the litigation against some of the responsible parties. Then moved into the White House counsel's office and worked on the litigation representing the White House with the Department of Justice. And then there was a law that was passed called the Restore Act. Typically when there's an oil spill, the funds, the civil and administrative penalties go to the Coast Guard to respond to future spills. Well, the Senate got together and said, you know, these funds should come back to the Gulf of Mexico where the injury took place. So they created the Restore Act, which called for a new federal agency. So I volunteered to move to the Gulf of Mexico from Washington, and there were two reasons. One, I was passionate about the work. The other is I was passionate about my now wife, who is a Cajun from Opelousas, Louisiana, who told me that if I wanted this relationship to work, I needed to move to Louisiana because she wasn't moving to Washington. So those two things came together, and about a decade ago I moved to New Orleans, stood up the Restore Council, and did work from South Texas to the Florida Keys for 4 years, and have been at the Water Institute of the Gulf for the last 5.5. It may not be as exciting as the journey that Deb has taken. I've never driven or piloted a destroyer, but the work that we're doing in particular in the space of engineering with nature is inspirational at least.
Well, thank you both very much for taking the time to share. I think it's always good to know something about an individual when we're going to engage in this conversation for the next little while about nature as a national priority. And I just to start the ball rolling initially, you know, I wanted to have you guys kind of comment or reflect kind of generally, because what we might now call the nature-based solutions movement has really been growing for decades. Even though it's a relatively recent term in use today, sometimes you see it reflected as natural infrastructure, it really has been a decades-long journey. If you go back to Professor Odom and the development of ecological engineering, or Ian McHarg in the field of urban planning and landscape architecture with his book, Design with Nature in 1969, you know, this has been a long journey. We started, as you both know, Engineering with Nature as an initiative and a program within the Army Corps of Engineers in 2010. So we're at the kind of later stages of that journey. But there's so much activity going on across the country in this space at the federal and the state and the local level, in universities and in the private sector, and also internationally through UN level activities. At COP26 this year, I participated in 2 panels that were wholly devoted to nature-based solutions, and there were others. And I expect that momentum will continue. So I just want you to maybe kind of start us off by kind of reflecting upon this space that we call engineering with nature, and where, you know, you think we're headed, or what you think of it generally. Maybe we'll start with Justin this time.
Sure. I think the movement and growth around nature-based solutions and natural infrastructure, in many ways, I think it reflects a very healthy humility. This recognition that we simply can't just build traditional infrastructure alone. That's not going to solve the problems of today, and certainly the problems that we face in the future. Now, that's not to say stop with traditional infrastructure and just move all to nature-based infrastructure. That's not a successful solution either. But this recognition that, first of all, when you put traditional infrastructure solutions on the landscape, oftentimes you will find unintended consequences, some positive, some not so positive. The use of nature-based solutions can not only yield ecosystem service benefits, community resilience, and social values, but also enhance the abilities of traditional infrastructure to function. So I think it's really a very practical recognition that to continue living in places that we want to live, to continue our very way of life and our economic, maintain our economic vitality, it's a requirement that we find ways to integrate nature-based solutions into our traditional infrastructure. And I think you're absolutely right. The growth has been awe-inspiring, really, how quickly it's happened, how quickly the science has developed, how quickly best practices have developed and continue to. So I think it really goes back perhaps to a healthy degree of humility.
I mean, maybe summing up, I would say, progress is dependent on partnering with nature in the 21st century. I'm as convinced of that as I am most anything. But Deb, what are your thoughts as we just start off the discussion about nature-based solutions and that journey?
It's funny that Justin started with the word humility, because that's this morning as I was thinking of hubris, kind of the flip side of that, which is, climate change is this fundamentally natural phenomenon. And we see that, when we fight Mother Nature, we lose pretty much every time.
She bats last.
She bats last. Yeah. We might win initially, but she has the power to overcome generally the things that we build. So like the hubris to think that we could build our way or tech our way out of the climate crisis, I think is hubris and ill-placed. So we have to work with nature. And again, I will say what Justin said and what you said. It's engineering with nature, and it's nature-based solutions, and we're in a wonderful place in time where we have made tremendous technological advances, and we should absolutely leverage those to the nth degree. And if we just observe the way nature has been managing these phenomenon for millennia, we have something to learn as well. And the combination of those two is what's so powerful. And in terms of the moment that we're in, we were talking about this earlier. When you champion nature-based solutions, you can kind of feel a bit of imposter syndrome. Because it's been about other things. Climate has been about other things for a really long time. And at least in the military, when I came in and was going to be the climate advisor, and I was like, I'm going to tell people to work with nature, you kind of have some misgivings about that. Like, are they going to laugh me out of the room? Like, get serious. We build destroyers, or But really, at the end of the day, people are humans. There's a humanity and a collective experience and recognition that unites us. And I've found myself to be pushing on an open door. I mean, I'll say 99 times out of 100. I would say 100 times out of 100. Even when I remember an early call that I had, and it doesn't matter who I was talking to, but I was talking about climate change, and there was this gentleman who was like, we need to focus on war fighting, and that's a bunch of baloney, and don't mess with our planes, and et cetera, et cetera. But when I got him to talk about nature-based solutions, he was like, oh yeah, we can do all that. We could totally put more green space here, wetlands there. So it was a unifying conversation, and it's a very practical conversation. So I think it's our moment, and we should stop actually saying that it's our moment, because it's truth.
Yeah, it's time to move on. I move forward. And I think crystallizing that point, I think, is the President's Executive Order 14072, issued just this past April on Earth Day. And for those who may not have looked at that, if you look at the title of Section 4 of this executive order, which is just a little over 3 pages long if you print it out from the Federal Register, but it's a very impactful 3 pages. But Section 4 of this executive order is titled Deploying Nature-Based Solutions to Tackle Climate Change and Enhance Resilience. And to have the White House, to have the President, put a point of emphasis on a particular kind of approach to solving, if you will, problems related to climate change and adaptation in complementary fashion with other approaches is a big deal. And I just wanted to ask Deb, you to start, to reflect on how big a deal, that is.
I think it's a big deal. Yes, this is not, this is a new part of the conversation, a new part of the climate conversation. Not really new. I mean, it's been around for decades, of course, but it's getting, I think, the attention and focus that it deserves because these are very meaningful solutions. So in the Department of the Navy, we put out a climate strategy called Climate Action 2030. And we cited that executive order and put nature-based resilience as kind of one of our preeminent goals and areas to focus on. We also set an affirmative target for drawing down carbon out of the atmosphere. So we said we want to draw down 5 million metric tons of CO2 additional from what we have now by 2027. That is an ambitious goal. It is not beyond the realm of the possible. And if we achieved it, it would be the equivalent of offsetting all of our emissions from our electricity that we consume on bases. Now, I say that very carefully because we are moving out very aggressively on reducing our emissions on bases. We are going full speed ahead, electrification, microgrids, energy efficiency. Like, we have a very mature, very dedicated energy program, and not just on our bases, but on our operational platforms, looking at how we can make them more efficient. And because ultimately that's a warfighting capability advantage when you're not tethered to fossil fuels, when you don't have kind of those logistical constraints, that is a very distinct warfighting advantage. So I put that all in context, and I just come back to the point that kind of I think of it as kind of 3 legs of a stool in the Department of the Navy climate strategy. We've got our operational platforms, which consume 75% of our emissions. We've got our bases and installations, which we've already talked about, and then we have nature. And in the Department of the Navy, we manage roughly just shy of 5 million acres of land. And so our 5 million metric ton target is absolutely doable. And it's going to require a real culture change in terms of, and real intentionality in terms of how we manage those lands, because that's not how we think of them now. I look at those lands and I see a resilience asset. I look at those lands and I see an opportunity for carbon drawdown in total consonance and supportive of the mission, not as a climate agenda, but as a mission resilience, combat effectiveness agenda. So we're excited about it, and there's a lot of work to be done and a lot of really enthusiastic people, and it's going to take some work.
Yes, indeed. I mean, within the Department of Defense, we roughly occupy 25 million acres of land and water. And in this context, that's 25 million acres of potential natural infrastructure to support mission resilience and to support climate mitigation. And land is not just something you build on top of, right? It provides functions, as you're highlighting here, that are valuable to us. So, Justin, going to you, when you think about, Earth Day 2022, the President's executive order, maybe in the context of where you live and work today in Louisiana, how big a deal?
It's as big a deal as you can imagine. So in Louisiana, where I live, we've lost approximately the amount of land of the state of Delaware, if you go back over a number of decades. There are nations who've gone to war to protect that amount of territory, and we've lost it. It's as an existential topic for people in Louisiana. After Hurricane Katrina, there was a $14.5 billion levee reconstruction around the city of New Orleans. It's wonderful, and it was well documented. It performed very well in Hurricane Ida last year. However, we know that you simply cannot rely on walls alone. You cannot rely strictly on these traditional solutions. You must have this wetland complex if you're going to live in an area like South Louisiana. And we recognize it's a river delta, right? That means it's always been changing. It's not the way that it was, and we can't make it the way it was in the 30s, for example. However, what we recognize is that, and we have some of the largest engineering with nature projects in construction and design right now ever attempted in human history. We recognize that by putting levees all along the Mississippi River, good news is we can prevent flooding, as they have been, for the large part, successful since the early 30s. However, we've cut off our natural sediment source that built that delta and replenished it. So what we're doing now, which is, I would argue, an engineering with nature project, is we're cutting holes effectively in the levees and building diversion projects, as were similar to what was discussed in the opening video. And it's a recognition that nobody's saying get rid of all the walls and the traditional infrastructure. Quite the opposite. We need to enhance that. But we also need to concurrently use Mother Nature, use the river to build back land and to make our communities more resilient. And what I think is so exciting about the Earth Day executive order is there's a recognition inside those words, that the value that we put on land, that we put on nature, is not simply the property value alone. And being able to intelligently talk about that and quantify those values, I think, is really where the work is going into the future. Because we're never going to have enough money to do everything we'd like to do. There's so many good ideas and well-deserving projects. We're going to always have to make difficult decisions. So how do we make those decisions? Are they based on science and evidence? Are they based in politics and who's got, the power, et cetera? How we choose to make those determinations, I think, is really going to shape the future of certainly how we live, not just in coastal environments, but certainly there, because you've got the surge, you've got the compound flooding challenges. But I think we're going to see this across the country and beyond. So big deal.
Very good.
I want to take this opportunity to remind our audience that is out there on social media platforms that you are part of the conversation. And so if you have questions for Ms. Loomis or Mr. Ehrenwerth, please put it in your comments as we have this discussion, and Dr. Bridges or I will ask those questions here in a few moments. And so we're going to continue the conversation about after the presidential announcement on Earth Day.
Yep, thanks, Shelley. Yeah, so let's look briefly as we go forward the three major commitments that the executive order makes in respect to nature-based solutions. And the first one is to prepare an interagency White House level report on means by which we could accelerate delivery of nature-based solutions. And the plan is for this report to be issued this fall in association with COP27. These are the actions, in other words, that the federal government can take to move forward with purpose on nature-based solutions. And so I'd like to ask you, Deb, reflect on the value of interagency or cross-organizational collaboration. We've been doing things between the Corps of Engineers and Engineering with Nature and the Navy, but what are your thoughts about that?
Well, going back to the accelerating of the deployment, you and I share a general impatience.
That's true in my experience.
But it's a well-placed impatience, because the climate science tells us this is the critical decade. And that's the one luxury we don't have, is time. And so, yes, as we embark, Navy is working with Army Corps, Engineering with Nature, and doing natural infrastructure assessments on over a dozen bases all over the country. The folks are excited. People are excited. They see the value. They see the utility. They want to scale them up. And so then you think about, okay, well, what about the permitting? And as a lawyer, I understand that, because that is that is very real. And I know regulators, et cetera, you have to consider impacts to species as you're building a barrier island, et cetera. It's not as easy as, but this is going to be a really good thing. There's some legal hurdles that you need to get through. They take time. These are novel solution sets sometimes. So I'm very much looking forward to that report and to have the federal government come together as a family. I think some of the work that we're doing with Engineering with Nature, we just had a site visit down at a base in South Carolina, and there was about 50 to 60 folks there from the state agencies, federal regulators, academia, Navy, that was a Marine Corps site, and Engineering with Nature, engineers, et cetera. So I think that is the kind of work that needs to be done. And as everyone in the federal government knows these days, there's actually a lot of funding coming our way, and time, again, I come back to time, is actually the real limiting factor, because everyone had a job in the Navy and Marine Corps before this happened, and climate change was not their actual day job. They were managing something else, and now you have this tremendous existential threat, and tremendous opportunities to make the base more resilient, et cetera. And it's just, it's a lot. So any kind of guidance on how to smooth those barriers and smooth those processes and a collective coming together of like, how do we do this smarter and faster? Because we have to deploy right now. I say, I'm not a researcher, I'm not a scientist, and it's great to study, and we just don't have time to study this to death right now. If this were kind of 30 years ago, we could do more studying, but we should continue to study as we go, and let's start doing what we know to do now. And that's another beautiful thing about the nature-based processes, is they allow you to evolve and adjust. And it's like, well, that didn't quite work, let's build it up more over here, versus like an engineered solution that might be more static, or you might be less kind of adjustable.
Yeah. Justin, let me ask you to maybe reflect on the report, but also the second commitment within the executive order, which directs the Office of Management and Budget to develop guidance on valuing nature.
So this it can be a very wonky topic. I think it is perhaps the most important facet in the policy process around really taking nature-based solutions and bringing them to scale nationally. So we have this very thoughtful process, the benefit cost analysis, where we look at, all right, lots of different things that we can do across the country. What's the benefit? What are the costs? What's the value of the property? What's the cost of the solution that we want to put on the landscape? And over time, the vast majority of the attention in these sort of analyses goes to the economics. What is the actual property value? How much does it cost to build a wall, for example? What we have not done as well a job over the years is keeping a pace with the science around valuing the benefits and costs of nature and the benefits of the social value benefits, for example, of nature-based solutions, but not just nature-based solutions, of all kinds of different features we can put on the landscape. So there's this whole question of what's the value of a tree and what does that mean? And there are people who will roll their eyes at that, and there are others, certainly in our world, where we say, look, there has been this movement over decades in the academy and beyond around getting to the crux of ecosystem service valuation. What is how do you quantify what we know is there? I said earlier, I know that the value of a piece of property in South Louisiana is not simply what it's assessed at. There are these other values that we know intuitively. How do you incorporate that knowledge into the policymaking process? And that's what I think is so encouraging about the executive order and this tasking to the Office of Management and Budget. The Water Institute, we've been working with a number of partners to support the engineering.
So on the study.
Sure, we have a study underway now that is coming to a conclusion. We'll have a summit in Washington, D.C. on November 30th, and hope everybody will participate, either in person or virtually, and more on that later. But we've spent the better part of the last year and a half, almost 2 years, looking at this question of how do you, in a practical way, put values on, quantify the benefits of nature, and look at the social benefits and the ecosystem service benefits. And how do you do it in a practical way that can be deployed across the country, the case of the Corps, across districts all over the nation, and can be done in an objective fashion by OMB. And we're very optimistic and excited to announce those results in a few months. But one thing that we're very confident is that you can't just take the sausage grinder of today and make it a better sausage grinder. You can't just put inputs in, turn the crank, and out spits the answer. We have to recognize that you can use science and this kind of analysis to inform decision making. And we need to do a better job of not just saying, here are the economics, the social and environmental benefits are acknowledged but not quantified. But at the end of the day, if we simply make a better sausage grinder, we've missed a very important opportunity where we can put policy preferences and recognizing the inherent uniqueness of particular communities. So at the end of the day, we're very optimistic and I think excited about what will come, but there's a recognition that it's not just the evaluation. The formulation of projects with non-federal sponsors all the way through the process needs to reflect where we're ultimately trying to go.
I mean, you've identified another issue. There's as Deb was saying, kind of like science for science sake, and there's a place for that. But then there's this more applied space, policy research. Needs to be, must be science and evidence informed. Usually when those things are decoupled, you tend to have problems, right? If policy detaches itself from the realities of the physical world that we're in. But Deb, can you maybe comment, because it's a different calculus for the Navy, right? Where mission resilience is, primary in focus. How do you think about how the Navy and the Department of Defense and the services will be taking on board this idea? How do we think about the value of the natural assets that we have a fence around?
Yeah, I mean, I try to say, I think of it as not two different things, because ultimately, if your mission is threatened, like that is, people say, oh, this is about mission or this is about climate. Like, those are not two different things. They're actually, like, we never do something just for the climate. We are the Department of the Navy. Our job is to, go out and defend the nation, and that is what we will do. And so, but these bases, when they do offer value to us that is beneficial to everything we do on that base. If we just paved over that base, it would not function. It would not support the mission and the warfighters and all of the civilians, et cetera, that need to do that mission. So I think it's just being holistic and taking account of things, as Justin was saying, that have just gone assumed. And now I think climate change is challenging those assumptions. Like, whereas you could just sort of assume that there was a status quo, the status quo is changing in a way that you need to affirmatively kind of think about that. Like, how am I going to get the resilience that I need so that I can continue doing this mission? So that's how I think about it, just very, very kind of hand in hand, not as two different things at all.
Yeah. Well, there's one other final bit of the executive order, and we're getting to the point where we're going to transition and take some questions from the audience. But the third commitment that the executive order makes in respect to nature-based solutions is for the federal government to perform the first ever national nature assessment. This is analogous to the national climate assessment that has been underway for many years now on the state of affairs with respect to climate change in the country. But this one will be different but complementary in that it's focusing on nature, the status of nature, and the values or the benefits that nature provides to the country, and how we should be taking that into consideration in the future. And I shared with both of you this morning that I was asked to be the Department of Defense's representative to the Federal Steering Committee for the National Nature Assessment. And I gotta say, not just because I was asked to participate in this way, but this is a huge deal. And I think it complements a growing recognition, I think, in our country of how important nature is. If you had any experiences at national parks, for example, in the last year and a half or so, and how many people are trying to reconnect with nature after the last 3 years of isolation, you can appreciate that. But I'd like to start with you, Deb, this National Nature Assessment and its intersection with DoD. Do you think it's a big deal like I do?
I think it's a big deal. I'll be so interested to see how you tackle that. It's such a huge undertaking, and I think, though, it's a really important step towards getting data. Because kind of going back to my previous answer, if it's not measured or thought of, it's just sort of doesn't exist. And so it's bringing into relief something that, DoD, Department of Navy, we're really great at making decisions based on certain inputs. But if you're not part of the input, back to your sausage grinder analogy, if you're not part of the conversation, you can't influence the decision making. So one of the parts of our strategy, one of the lines of effort is climate-informed decision-making. And so how many, hundreds and thousands of decision-making processes are there in the Department of the Navy? and how should you be thinking about climate change? Where should you be inputting climate considerations into those decisions? And so nature is one example. If we have values on nature, then I can say, okay, I have this parcel of land. I would like to either kind of lease it out. I could lease it out for a solar farm. I could lease it out and put a store on it. I could do any number of things, but unless I know what that piece of property is doing for me, somewhere from an ecological, what the value of those natural functions are, I don't know how to value that real estate transaction, for instance. So I think it's tremendously valuable, and I think I don't envy your work. It seems like a giant task, and there could be no better person for the job. So thank you for taking that on.
Yeah, thank you for the endorsement. Yeah, I think. Justin, what are your thoughts?
I completely agree. I think what doesn't get measured doesn't get counted, and that's what this is about to me. And I think that by having what you could argue is a baseline assessment, that will help us as a nation adaptively manage. It will help every facet of the government, because I really like the way Deb put it. It's not like you've got your nature-based climate work over here and your direct mission over here. These things do come together and intersect, and if we don't have the appropriate data, then our decision-making will be necessarily not as good. And so that's why I couldn't be more excited about the assessment, the ability to better value nature, and then ultimately we hope the ability to make better funding decisions. Because at the end of the day, that's what this I think really reduces to, is what are we going to implement? What are we going to fund?
What do we support? How do we invest? It's very easy to take Mother Nature for granted, that she will always be there when we need her, and that's a very shaky assumption.
Yes.
Yeah, we need to reciprocate, and take care of her as well. So I'm just gonna tee up the last question I'm gonna ask you as we close. What do you think of, if you picked one kind of practical next step from your point of view to make progress in your domain with respect to nature-based solutions? But I think we'll transition now to a few questions from the audience.
And so that is your cue, audience. If you have any questions for Ms. Loomis or Mr. Ehrenwerth, we encourage you to put them in your comments, regardless of which social media platform you are on. So our first question is for Ms. Loomis. How is the Navy using nature-based fuels for its fleets? What is happening now and what's to come in the future?
Got right to the heart of the matter.
Jump right in.
Yeah, fuels are a big topic, and we are actively testing. We are testing for the compatibility of all of the fuels that are out there, all the synthetic fuels and biofuels that we know of. We are very actively working to make sure that they are compatible with our processes, with our platforms, and we have investments in a couple of biofuel refinery plants as well. So more to follow on that. We are in our implementation planning process. So we released a strategy in late May, and we're in a kind of an implementation planning, which we hope will be done this fall. And I think we'll be able to put a finer point on some initiatives, but we are still actively working in that space.
Very good. So it is something that the Navy is addressing, and there's going to be
more
to
I mean,
come
because
in the
it's not
future.
just us. We're not the only ones out there. Synthetic fuels are much bigger than the Navy, and we need to be able to operate. For the Europeans are far ahead of us in this space, and so we need to be able to take fuel wherever we operate. And so that is why the focus on the compatibility at this point, because we recognize that, of course, commercial airlines are also making great strides in this space. So we are just working hand in hand with industry, making sure we stay apace, for sure, and then we'll see sort of where else we can take that.
Very good. My next question is for Mr. Ehrenwerth. What are some nature-based infrastructure solutions for places like Florida, which stands to lose tons of land in the face of sea level rise? So what are some of the lessons you've learned from Louisiana, and how can those be used in other places like Florida?
Well, I should say, just to start, Florida has a long history of using nature-based solutions and is doing more and more of that kind of work. And it's interesting because, when you say Florida, yes, it's one state, but it's so different. When you're talking about the Panhandle into the Curve to South Florida, I mean, these are it's all one state, but very diverse ecology and challenges. The challenges that you'll find in a place like Miami Beach are Herculean. I mean, we've got wonderful ideas and great attention on the challenges that you face in the urban context. We've seen a lot of, I think, very good solutions around water quality, which is a big challenge, as is quantity. We've seen living shoreline projects. We've seen the ability of coral reefs to attenuate waves. In fact, we've seen insurance and reinsurance companies actually writing policies around the importance of coral reefs in that geography to attenuate waves. So really using nature and writing policies around it. So I think some of the most interesting work is happening in Florida. I'm a little biased towards Louisiana because that's home, but we have wonderful colleagues and collaborations with folks in various parts of Florida. In fact, right now, the Water Institute, we're doing the resiliency strategy for Jacksonville. And I think it's very interesting when we were talking about earlier the challenges of too much water versus not enough. We spent some time looking across the I-10 corridor, so all the way from Los Angeles to Jacksonville, and thinking about these challenges and the commonalities. And there's a lot that we're doing in places like Louisiana and Texas that can help with the challenges in Florida. And there are things that we're learning from our colleagues in the Desert West that can help us as well. So I think having areas and collaborative laboratories like what the Engineering with Nature program has done, I think is just really the key for all of us in the future, Florida and beyond.
Yeah. Can I add,
And beyond.
I'm going to
Yes.
add something to Aaron's point, because one of the things that we did this morning is we took Aaron and a colleague to one of our wave flumes here at ERDC, where we have physical representations of mangroves.
Yes, our mangroves.
In the wave flume. Why is it there? Because physical modeling is a very important source of evidence with regard to conventional infrastructure as well as nature-based infrastructure. So our colleagues here are studying, how mangroves actually affect the orbital velocities of waves. So we have the data that's necessary to make modifications to our engineering models so that we can understand how to design these integrated solutions. And just a statistic, the state of Florida has 500,000 acres of mangroves. These literally are forests at the interface of the water and the land that are providing, based on published peer-reviewed science, that are providing billions of dollars of reduced flood damages for Florida. So that information is so important, because if you're not valuing that service that your mangrove forests are providing to you, then you're operating blindly, if you will, with respect to how you should be formulating strategies in the future for the state. And one final point, the University of Florida is one of our Engineering with Nature partners and collaborators in the Network for Engineering with Nature, and they're doing fabulous work across the state.
And I have to say one more thing about mangroves, because you're absolutely right in everything you said, and there's even more, because their roots do such a great job of keeping the material together. And they grow very quickly, right? So that biomass is just, not only is it keeping the material together, but you're capturing and sequestering carbon. And so I think this is the beauty of nature-based solutions generally, is that there are all these different co-benefits. It was fascinating to see the experiments happening in the flume across the way here. And that's a benefit that we're measuring right now. And there are all these other benefits that we're measuring in different places like Louisiana and in Florida. And so the hope of the movement around this work, if you will, is that you keep stacking those benefits up, and the viability and the need to invest becomes clearer and clearer to us all.
And what's fascinating with your statistic, it goes back to what Justin was saying about calculating these returns on investment and being able to communicate that to the decision makers of why this is important and putting a tangible number to it of what is the value of a tree, well, what is the value of a mangrove, and we do know some of that, and we need to be communicating that to the decision makers. And so our next question is to whichever one of you wants to jump in and answer this one. How are you going to involve local communities and indigenous communities to gain support of nature-based solutions? So how are you going to involve this, not just at a national level, but at a local level?
You've got lots to say. I'm sure I have lots to say too. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I'll give an example. So we're working, we have a wonderful project we call the Partnership for Our Working Coast around Fourchon, Louisiana. And there the port is planning to dredge to ultimately 50 feet to be able to surface larger vessels. Well, that dredging to 50 feet is going to yield somewhere between 20 and 30 million cubic yards of material, which is a gold mine in a sediment-starved area like South Louisiana. And so the question becomes, what do you do with all that material? Where do you put it? And so we have really advanced numerical models that can help us answer those questions. What we did is we got a group of stakeholders from around the geography of Fourchon. And we brought everybody together and we introduced what numerical models are for those who weren't as familiar, and had a long set of engagements with this group of stakeholders. And we said, where do you think this material should go? What are the threats that you see? Not asking them to use a numerical model and generate it, but just asking them. And as time went on, and we just finished this project a month or so ago, what we found is that what the stakeholders argued for, the numerical models agreed. And the ranking, there was agreement. And I think what that shows is, yes, numerical models are very important, and we should continue to use them and continue to enhance them. But there is this ecological knowledge, whether it's traditional ecological knowledge or whether it's simply engaging with people who have lived in an area for generations. You're going to find on the science side of things, you're going to get ideas that you hadn't thought of. And we take those ideas, we put them into the numerical models to see how they perform, and we find that there is very powerful knowledge in the hands of people who have lived in an area, which should be no surprise to anyone. And so I think where we take that is when we're beginning to think about a solution, at the very beginning of the process, how do you engage in a meaningful way, not 3 minutes at a microphone at a public meeting, but in a deeply meaningful way, the ecological knowledge that exists in the community, and to take that all the way through the process. Not wait till you have your idea and then give that group the 3 minutes at the microphone, but have that true engagement. If we do that and do that right, we're going to just have better solutions that we put on the landscape.
I agree. Ms. Loomis, do you have any comments to that?
Yeah. So I think that's why one of the many reasons I'm so excited to be working with Engineering with Nature, because their model, their whole process calls for bringing in a coalition of stakeholders, from regulators to the local communities to the state regulators to NGOs and the community as well. These problems are not like this. The problem and the solution should not be limited to the fence line of a military installation. It has to. Our goal is to develop solutions that are at scale so that they benefit our neighboring communities as well. We all bring authorities, different capabilities, different sources of money, and we are stronger together. We have some kind of affirmative pots of money. The Department of Defense, there's an Office of Local Defense Community Cooperation. They put out grant programs. Congress has been generously funding them, and signs are that they will be more generously funded to come, because they recognize that climate resilience is a huge need. And so there are programs that one of them in particular, like Department of Navy, the services cannot apply for those grants. They must be applied for by the local municipality and then work in collaboration with the services. So that is a perfect model, and a large focus area is resilience. So that is an example of a place that we will do that quite naturally. That is, one of my goals is we really need to flip the script in terms of looking at, I have a living shoreline, look at how cool that is. That's my kind of vanity project, to if you look at a base, and we've gone to about 11 or 12 or 13 of them now, You go to a base, you guarantee you will find stuff that needs to be done. It is not the like, oh, we could have it here. It's like, we need this stuff in some variation everywhere. And we have a monumental task, and we're all in this together, and we can't each fund this alone. But if we come together, we can each bring our authorities, our capacities, our expertise, and our funding sources together to build better solutions.
I have also said, in regards to progress, that progress runs on the rails of relationships. And in this regard, it's critical. And just highlighting one recent experience, last month I spent the day at the Santa Clara Pueblo, north of Albuquerque in New Mexico, with Governor Chavarria and his team. We've had an ongoing Engineering with Nature project with the Pueblo for the last couple of years related to a really devastating wildfire that affected a very important landscape in Santa Clara Canyon there, which we spent several hours looking at what was done and the engineering. And there's so much to be gained from substantive engagement with a diversity, right, of community members, including the knowledge that they bring that we might think of as somewhat inaccessible, but they've been living there for thousands of years. I think they know their land and how it works. And we need to be humble enough, to be able to go there and learn. Yeah, we might want to take that knowledge that they have and put it into one of our models. That'll make us feel more comfortable. But they've been there a long time, and I think they have a lot to share with us, and that collaboration is going to continue.
And how we get that knowledge from the locals, of the knowledge management aspect of it, of having those relationships and bringing that knowledge into the science.
Yes, that's right.
Capturing it.
Right.
It's easier said than done.
Right. One of the fourth, principle of Engineering with Nature, as we've highlighted, is science-based collaboration and engagement. There are tools that we can bring to this to make the engagement more substantive, more meaningful, more productive. And that's one of, as Deb was highlighting, one of the things that we're doing in the program.
It's very fascinating. So how do you, and this goes back to either one of you, how do you practically apportion the cost of impacts to those who benefit from not having to pay for them, particularly when it's tough to monetize ecosystem services in a way that we all agree to? So Justin, that may be more in your lane.
Sure, yeah, I think it's an important question because the work of ecosystem service valuation has been going on for decades. And I'm not a scientist by training, so I don't want to say something that I don't know much about, but I do believe that we're never going to have it just perfect. We're always going to recognize, and I think this is true with any model, numerical model or otherwise, you always want more data. You always want more inputs. There's always something else that you could measure and account for. I think the more interesting question is, how do you do it in a meaningful and practical way that has some imperfection necessarily, and to be comfortable with that? Because as Deb said, we don't have the luxury. We can't wait. We can't say, well, let's not do anything until we can figure out how to put a numerical value on every single input that could be counted. So I think there's a real challenge within that question of how do you do this in an equitable fashion? How do you do this in a responsible fashion? I think the initiatives like the Justice 40 initiative really move our attention to the question of how can you put, in this context, how can you put nature-based solutions on the landscape that benefit historically disadvantaged populations, currently disadvantaged populations? But if anybody is waiting for the moment in time where all practitioners of ecosystem service valuation will agree on every facet of it, forget it. We don't have that time, and it will never come anyway. So how do you do it in a responsible and practical way where you can move out? Because again, as Deb said, we just don't have the luxury of waiting.
Something needs to be done now.
Yes.
That's right. So will the National Nature Assessment be granular enough to provide key information at the parcel scale, easy to measure vegetation cover, but hard to measure percentage of invasive species remotely? So when you talk about the National Nature Assessment, how how far in depth is that going to go?
Yeah. That's a very good technical question, you know, and the Federal Steering Committee has only had its first call, you know, about a week ago.
So so what have you done in a week?
Yeah, exactly. Why isn't this finished? The report is scheduled to be delivered by 2026. But one of the discussions that was held and was led by Jane Lubchenko and the Office of Science Technology Policy was the opportunity we have to leverage advanced technology to understand what is going on with nature. The video beforehand, the remote sensing assets. Right. Of course, they have to be ground truthed, you know, to the reality and with data. But you know, that's the work of this scoping phase of the effort, is to determine, you know, what it's going to do, how it's going to be shaped, and what expertise to draw into it, and, you know, if you will, what technologies and science to draw into it, because ultimately it has to be science-based, has to be evidence-based, and it will be. So I don't have a specific answer for that question other than to say that.
Very good. So this goes to this would go to Ms. Loomis. What are your thoughts on transferring nature solutions at military installations to civilian communities and industries? And do you have any examples of that?
I'm not sure I understand transferring.
I guess more like transferring your knowledge that you've learned on military installations on how to implement engineering with nature or nature-based solutions. What have you learned from a military standpoint in your job that could lend itself to, say, maybe a small community off of Louisiana coast?
Yeah.
What could we learn?
Well, I think broadly the military has often served as a test bed for lots of things, right, that then get transferred to the civilian sector. So I think that's very like 30,000 foot level. We have lots of partnerships with lots of NGOs, et cetera, that I think also transfer knowledge. And I'll just speak to where we are right now. One of the places that I'm excited about that we are just kicking off some work is in the Desert Southwest. So when Todd and I spoke about engineering with nature efforts and where we wanted to collaborate, kind of the obvious places are around coastal resilience, right? And engineering with nature has done a lot of work on that. And there's a lot of really developing but pretty solid understanding of tool sets and solution sets there. And we're still evolving. But I said, you know, ground zero for climate change is desertification. And we have our Desert Southwest, and we manage a couple million acres. So people think of the Navy as being coastal, but we manage a few million acres, a couple million acres in desert, especially when you count like training ranges in very arid installations in Arizona, California, et cetera. So I said, I really want to look there. And because if we can figure out how to kind of reverse the trend of aridification. I saw an article the other day that was like, we need to stop calling it drought and start calling it aridification. And I thought that was really insightful, because drought kind of suggests that, oh, well, this is just sort of an episodic thing. No, we are like drying out. And so if we can test some approaches there, and back to the cows, we are going to try some kind of regenerative grazing, but like what are the other solution sets? So we're looking at sort of stone structures and, you know, gabions and compost and biochar, where we're just brainstorming. And this is why, you know, this is a great partnership to be like, what can we try? Where on these vast landscapes where, you know, we have dominion over very large territories, and then we can sort of bring in academia, bring in partners to learn, because this, I think of it from a geopolitical standpoint and a national security standpoint, kind of aridification and water security, food security is the scourge of climate change, and is what's going to cause the mass instability. I mean, we're seeing the flip side of that in Pakistan right now with massive flooding, and so we see that. But I think kind of long term, it's the water security, food security that scares me the most for the planet and for our national security and for global security. So I'm really excited about using our platform in desert bases for collaboration, and I welcome people have solution sets and want to try them out. We have some very forward-leaning commanders and natural resource managers who have put their hands up to say we're willing to kind of try out some approaches. So I'm excited about that.
I think another catch point I would make here is that our solutions and our infrastructure systems have to be able to walk and chew gum. And what I mean by that is we've perhaps perfected the idea of kind of single-purpose solutions, but we have such a broad range of challenges in these landscapes, as you point out, in the Southwest. While the Southwest is now gripped by a mega drought that's more intense than any that has occurred in that region in 1,200 years, one data point being Lake Mead, our largest reservoir in the country, 40 million people more or less depend on water from that reservoir, is now below 30% capacity. You can see the bathtub ring, as it's called, in that reservoir today. But at the same time, that region's also subject to flooding. So you have to reconcile in your head and then in your infrastructure systems that while we're in a drought, we're also subject to flooding, as we've seen over the last few weeks in the Southwest. I was just in Moab just a few weeks ago, and they got slammed with a flood in Moab, Utah. I was just in, maybe catastrophe follows me, I don't know, but I was just in Death Valley, experiencing the heat of the summertime in Death Valley. 6 days later, they have what is described as a 1,000-year rain event where they got 75% of their annual precipitation in one day. It took out every road, stranded 1,000 people, and buried up, up to the wheel wells, hundreds of cars. So drought, but flooding, the whole spectrum, we have to have integrated solutions that draw from the conventional, but with a big assist and support from Mother Nature.
And I think that that's something hard for people to wrap their heads around, is it's not the single event of this one thing. It's these compounding events that are happening over and over again, of not just the drought and the flooding, but you have wildfires that then cause debris flooding and rain on snow, and it keeps compounding of these problems. So you can't look at it as one event. This is a holistic problem. And so one of the last questions we have from our audience is, what is the challenge to changing the mindset and getting these policies enacted?
I'm going to combine my challenge to you, because I think it's a natural one here.
Yes, I agree.
What's the practical action that you think could be undertaken in the next year, kind of on this point? We have to move forward.
So the mindset, I think a lot is on education. At least I'll speak with just the military context, and the kind of warfighter ethos and tech and all of that. So when you talk about nature, it's sort of like, like birds and bunnies, like we got that, like we have to manage endangered species. Like that's how we've been living with nature, is like we have lands, we've got to manage it for species, et cetera. We know we have to do that. But it's not been viewed as, or at least not in a kind of across the board way, viewed as a solution set, and sort of the skill set that is needed to bring these solutions to life doesn't really reside so well in the military. Like we have natural resource managers who again manage the species, et cetera. And then you've got your engineers who deal with a lot of great infrastructure, and this is a seam. So in terms of the, I think you need to educate people on both the power of these solutions, that these are not kind of throwaway solutions, that this is a legitimate solution set that is like more robust and powerful than a lot of other things that we're going to engineer. So I think there's that education, there's having the right people and the right training around these, there's talking about it. So kind of a practical thing that we're looking to do is really kind of just, is like wonky, but in an organization where you have these stovepipes, you need to bring the stovepipes together and say, you need to talk, or we need to create the third way, or like we need to like make sure that this is a discipline that everyone appreciates. So that's one of the things that we're working on. because like I said, funding is not the issue right now. It's more the understanding of the possibility of the solution set.
One of the things I really appreciate about you, you are an integrator and a networker. Through you, have had conversations with people I would probably never have met. And that's the kind of skill set that's necessary for these complex, these wicked problems, because you have to really expand and draw from your network to be able to bring the conversation that's necessary to make progress. But.
Well, I would completely agree with what Deb said, and I think you're right, Todd. Collaboration is just at the center of all of it. And I think as it relates to changing the mindset, I think part of what we need to recognize is that the barriers that have historically been suggested to large-scale engineering with nature solutions, those barriers are collapsing and have collapsed. People used to say, well, we don't have the science, we don't have the understanding of how to do this. Well, you've published the international guidelines for this. Well, we don't have the legal authorities, perhaps in the Corps of Engineers or others, to think about this in the right way. Over the last few years, we've seen with Water Resource Development Acts and other pieces of legislation, those questions have been answered. Well, what about the funding? We don't have enough funding to do this work. As Deb said, funding's not the problem right now. Between the IIJA and the Inflation Reduction Act, I mean, there's more funding to do this kind of work than we've ever seen in this nation's history. And then the last that some people say is, well, what about making it a priority? Well, the President of the United States has issued an executive order on this topic. So I think those barriers that we've seen historically have fallen. And so now we've got to get very practical. I appreciate that part of the question. And I think a big piece of this work is to translate the complexity of ecosystem service valuation into tangible tools that, in the case of the Corps of Engineers, someone in a district, any part of the country, may have a tool that he or she can use from the formulation all the way through evaluation of a potential project to see those true values, to be able to quantify and in some cases monetize these benefits that we know are there. I think we now have the capability, and it's really about being practical. And the final thing I'll say is that it's also this, back to, I guess, to where I started, this sort of humility, that we're not going to be able to quantify everything. We're not going to monetize everything, and we shouldn't try. We should use that sort of data and those sort of techniques to help inform our decision making, but we can't ever make the enemy the perfect of what must happen now.
That's a great wrap up. And I just want to first express my heartfelt gratitude that you took time out of your very busy schedules to come here and have this conversation with us. I mean, I've so thoroughly enjoyed my engagement with both of you and our collaboration and our partnership. And I think through the discussion that we've had this morning, you all have provided our audience with the evidence for what I have said, that you are among my two most favorite lawyers.
We both said we were recovering.
Right.
Recovering
we
lawyers.
could kind of not even really claim that title anymore.
Passed the bar exam, but I don't think that means very much anymore yet.
Well, your education has served you both well.
Thank you. And Todd, I want to thank you for your leadership. I mean, so much of what we've talked about today, you've been at this a long time, and I hope you feel the pride that you should, and all of us in this world and in this movement, if you will, are grateful to you and to the entire EWN family.
Yes, I mean, everything meaningful happens by a team.
Hear, hear.
That's
Yes.
right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
And with that, we're going to end today's conversation. And I would also like to thank our guests. It's always a joy for me to talk to people who also find joy in their work. And so it has been an amazing conversation. Thank you for coming. And for our audience, we will be back next month. And if you have questions, we're going to continue to take those. And we can have these conversations and send our guests the questions and respond to them. And also, I can't leave without saying, if you want to learn more about engineering with nature, all you have to do is go to engineeringwithnature.org, or actually you could just Google EWN. They have a phenomenal website, and along with one of my absolute favorite podcasts that you can listen to across any podcast player that you have. Until next time, find your joy, and we'll talk to you again next month.